It's been a few weeks since we've done any whiskey on this channel, so it's time to put two of my favourite budget bourbons head to head. Hello and welcome back to the channel, and yes, that's right, it has been a few weeks since we've done any whiskey content of any sort on the channel, simply because Oktoberfest kind of took over, but that's done now, so it's time to get back to the stronger malt choice. Today we're going to be looking at these two. We've got Bulleit Bourbon, we've got Woodford Reserve, and to be honest, the reason I picked these two for today's video is because every time I feature either of these whiskies alongside something else for a comparison, I get a load of comments saying, I just don't think they're very good, they weren't a very good comparison. Interestingly, these are pretty much the cheapest whiskies on my whiskey shelf behind me, and yet I actually really enjoy them. Yes, they're not the most spectacular, but I do find them interesting. As a result, I thought it'd be interesting to pitch them head to head to find out what the key differences are, and if you are going to go for a budget bourbon, which one of these will be better suited to you. Just before we get into them, I'm going to put the mash bills on screen now. Both of these are relatively rye heavy. Bulleit coming in with the higher rye mash bill with 68% corn, 28% rye and 4% barley. And then onto the Woodford with a 72% corn, 18% rye and 10% barley. From that, we can assume that both of these are going to be quite rye spicy, but obviously the Bulleit taking a significant lead on that. The Woodford comes in at 43.25%, which is slightly obscure, but it is what it is. And then the Bulleit in at 45%. As a result, we can do the Woodford first, with it being slightly weaker, and especially given that the Bulleit's got the high rye content, I think that makes the most sense. So let's get into it. I will show you the bottles, but I'm pretty sure you're pretty familiar with them at this point, as they are available worldwide very easily at this point. The Woodford has this beautiful, really wide but not very thick bottle. As a result, the colour in that is actually quite impressive, given obviously the colour of the whiskey will dilute effectively as it thins, so it's a thin bottle, so yeah, it's quite confident in the colour it shows off there. And meanwhile, the Bulleit Bourbon has this it's kind of an old medicine style bottle from the Americas of old, and it always has this slightly squiffy label on it. I assume they're hand labelled for that reason, but yeah, they're never quite straight, and that is on purpose. So Woodford first, let's listen for that cork. Not bad, not bad. This bottle is about 5 or 6 months old now. And I am going to pour the Bulleit as well, just so they've got time to breathe. Cork check. Disappointing, I think it's fair to say, but it is what it is. In the glasses, then, they do look very similar. The Woodford has a slightly more orange-hued, honeyed vibe about it, slightly rich, almost copper colour in comparison. Meanwhile, the Woodford is it's a true gold. It's about as generic a whiskey colour as you're going to get, whether it's bourbon or anything else, to be honest. But it's not too rich, it's not too dark, but it's just nice. It's right down the middle, nothing too untoward whatsoever. In terms of my preference, I think I'd always go with the slightly, it's not even darker actually, the Woodford, but it does have just this extra thing about that being slightly amber coloured, makes it look a bit more considered somehow. It's completely irrelevant, of course, but it is what it is. So Woodford first. Now with the Woodford, I know a lot of people say it's fruity, it's honey, apricot, you know, those sorts of notes, and the honey's definitely there. There is a fruity element, but interestingly, I've always got quite a little bit of an antiseptic TCP note out of it. It's not quite as strong or as dominant as you would find that flavour in, say, an Islay Scotch, but it's definitely there. Something very cleansing, almost. There are lots of notes in this that hark back to just the kind of de facto bourbon, if that is even a thing anymore. You know what I mean. Caramel, vanilla, fudgy, those kind of just super sweet, very confectionery-driven notes. But the fruit element really does outweigh them, and I really just can't get away from that slightly antiseptic thing on it. I love it, I find it interesting, but I can understand why it may not be for everyone. On to the aroma for the Bulleit then. It's actually got a much softer aroma despite being the stronger ABV whiskey, and it doesn't come across anywhere near as sweet. It's got spice in droves, it's peppery, it's prickly, and that probably isn't a massive surprise given the nearly 30% rye in the mash bill here. But There's almost a salinity to this one. It's not quite salty, but it's so unsweet compared to most bourbons on the nose that it's almost driving you towards a more savoury alternative. Slightly more earthy. The woody, oaky notes really come through for me on that one. So quite different. If you like your sweet stuff, but with a bit of extra pizzazz, Woodford. And then if you like something a little less, I guess, dessert driven, at least in terms of the aroma, then the Bulleit gets that vote. In for the taste test then. Cheers. The first sip, all the time, of that Woodford, I seem to get this slightly aniseedy licorice vibe. It's not so much intensely in the flavour, but the way it dries the mouth out, along with just a few tips of the hat to those notes, it really drives that bit home for me. It's not too intense. It's relatively sweet, but I still don't think it's that cloying, that sticky. It's definitely got a relative freshness about it. Some of the woody notes do come through in the taste, even though they weren't there on the aroma, and there's a nice amount of kind of stone fruit, sweet but not over the top notes in there, right, kind of displacing a lot of that really intense caramel and toffee thing you get in a lot of bourbons. Those notes are still there though. It is distinctly vanilla, it is distinctly sugary, but it's very much balanced off by some more fruity notes, and then on that first kind of exhale after you've taken a sip, a little bit of that kind of cleaning antiseptic TCP thing that I mentioned from the aroma comes through, and it makes for something balanced. But as I said, that kind of TCP thing is something that's very reminiscent of some peated Scotch whiskey, and as a result I can see why, if you're not into that stuff, then this might be a little bit of a curveball when it comes to your bourbon. On to the Bulleit then. Oh, it's only slightly higher in ABV, but because of that rye, because of that spice content, it turns into much more of a fiery event on the palate. It's not just booze burn that you get here, but it's just a combination of things that makes you go, that is a touch fiery. But interestingly, it doesn't last. It cleans out very quickly, and you're left with a very distinct aftertaste, which I think I've tried to describe on a few occasions now and failed, but I think I'm nearly there, so bear with me a second. Despite being only a 4% barley on the malt bill, I'm actually getting like a vanilla shortbready drying on the back end there. It's quite biscuity, quite crisp. It's weirdly distinctly malty given how low, as I say, the malt is in the mash bill for this. There is a plethora of other flavours though before you get to that point. I think this would make a very good rusty nail or old fashioned because it's got this nice kind of almost orange pithy addition. It almost feels like your whiskey has got that little bit of orange from an old fashioned already in it at times. It's not necessarily strong, just a little bit acidic, a little bit citrus, but also quite sweet. And it's definitely leading down that kind of road. In addition though, the relatively normal bourbon flavours, little bit of vanilla, little bit of caramel, but it's more like, I don't know if this is a thing in the US, but in the UK there's a company called Thornton's. They're like a confectioner's, and you get this toffee it's just a bit, it is all sugar, but it's so, I don't know, so they do something to it where despite it being almost entirely sugar, it has this not entirely overly sweet, sickening thing about it. It's almost like they managed to get some bitterness in there to balance it out, and it feels like this is doing something very, very similar. Now then, that is the taste test done, but I need to decide which of these is my favourite and ultimately which one you should be buying depending on your preferences. In terms of a price, I never actually look at the prices before filming because they can often change by the time I get to editing the videos, so I'm going to put them on screen now from the UK perspective at least, of what the kind of ranges are for these two bottles in the UK right now, both often available in our UK supermarkets at this point. But in terms of a favourite, well, I think I know, but I need to go back and forth one more time just to be sure. Yeah, and that kind of has just proven it. I'm a Bulleit guy. The Bulleit bourbon is, in my mind, not the most exciting. It's not the most luxe. It's not the most special. But it has an awful lot going on for the price that it is. And to my palate, although there is a lot and there is quite a lot of intensity and the spice is very high, it just doesn't yield something that's too much. Meanwhile, the Woodford is a fantastic, cheap mixer or sipping whiskey. And to be honest, I have done that a lot with it, but the notes that I really enjoy out of the Woodford are those slightly off-key ones for bourbon and that you will get in Scotch, and truthfully those notes are often a lot better in Scotch whiskies, not necessarily at this price I might add, so that is a consideration. But yeah, if I'm looking for those, I'm probably going to go and grab something else off the shelf behind me. That said though, if you're trying to get into bourbon and Scotch is your thing, especially peated Scotch and some of those more Island and Highland inspired whiskies, not necessarily smoky ones, but you know, the ones with that medicinal quality or the saline-y thing, I think Woodford Reserve would be not a bad place to start in terms of a budget-friendly bourbon. On the flip side, if you like your spice, your fruits, your oranges, and something just slightly challenging, slightly fiery, but ultimately still in a well-balanced package, I think the Bulleit Bourbon is the way to go. I'm always torn, really, when it comes to these, because ultimately, which one I fancy actually depends on my mood. I really do genuinely like both of them, but more often than not, I am definitely coming over towards the Bulleit. But that is just my preference. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below, please, so we can get a good idea of what everyone else's favourite is, not just mine, of course. And I think that is really all I've got to say about them. So as always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like it. If you haven't already, subscribe if you'll be so kind. And I'll catch you next time. Cheers.